In wars throughout the 20th century, captivity stripped soldiers of their physical and emotional freedom. Some of them survived, others perished, and many more were permanently altered by their experience as prisoners of war. Warring nations have routinely used POWs as bargaining chips, propaganda tools, and as sources of information. Recognizing that prisoners could shed light on their side's intentions or military tactics, captors have used stealth, coercion, and humiliation to acquire those secrets. In a confrontation in which the captor holds almost all the power, POWs have learned to play a game of cat and mouse, relying on their wits and will to survive. And while the customs of war have required military guards to treat their prisoners humanely, many ignored these statutes and resorted to torture. Although the circumstances in each war have been unique to time and place, some common coping measures have emerged. Hardcore resistors extended the battlefield into the prison pen. Simulators survived by cooperating with their jailers, and escapers have been determined to return to their own lines no matter what the cost. The captivity experience forced many prisoners to reach deep within themselves to call upon every ounce of resourcefulness and resilience they could muster. Somehow, out of this catastrophic experience, individuals have risen to the challenge, providing stories full of intrigue, subterfuge, and heroism. At the turn of the 20th century, European diplomats convened the Hague Conferences in an attempt to establish a set of international laws that would regulate the treatment of POWs.
Each prisoner, under the requirements of the Hague Convention, had to give his rank and his name. The holding power was required to treat the prisoner humanely, and there were some other requirements too, that he had to receive mail and he had to be paid as an enlisted man. He could be made to work.
The ink was barely dry in the Hague Convention when the First World War put it to the test. World War I has been called the last chivalrous war. When fighting broke out in 1914, mass armies confronted one another on a scale never before seen. But on the battlefield, individuals still fought one another in hand-to-hand combat.
And it's during that period of confrontation, where the bloodlust is still up, that it's very dangerous to give up, because if you just suddenly stand up and hold up your hands and surrender, the person to whom you're trying to surrender is likely to bayonet you or shoot you, simply because you're at that point in time just another enemy. Now, if there's some distance between you so that they can see you at a distance and not get at you right away and motion you to come toward them, then you have a better chance of survival.
The ordeal of being taken captive is one of the most difficult experiences a soldier can endure. It is a moment in time when a man realizes that his fate is no longer in his own hands.
You're faced with a world of uncertainty. You don't know whether you're going to be executed. You don't know whether you're going to be put on a long march where you may die from causes over which you have no control at all. So you walk into a world of darkness, in a sense, and that's scary.
Quite understandably, you're in shock. One moment you're a free agent, and the next moment you no longer are. Often you're wounded, almost always exhausted, and quite often hungry as well. And so you're very disoriented. He's at his most vulnerable at that time. If you want to interrogate him and get information, that's when you do it.
The Great War soon flared into the world's first industrialized war. Advancements in technology enabled the warring nations to take more prisoners. Suddenly, the warring powers found themselves saddled with a new set of problems. Back in Germany, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers were held captive, but there was no systematic program in place for handling them. Their makeshift camps lacked food and adequate housing. Almost immediately, a typhoid epidemic killed thousands. In many instances, a prisoner's chance of survival depended upon his nationality.
It wasn't that the Germans necessarily mistreated people, deliberately. It was rather that some groups, the Russians and the Serbs, for example, had no national organizations set up to provide them with relief like we did.
The International Red Cross, established in Switzerland 50 years earlier, proved to be a life-saving organization that rescued tens of thousands of soldiers from starvation. As a neutral party, the Red Cross acted as a go-between, crossing the battle line to deliver food packages from countries on both sides to their prisoners of war.
It was tough to feed all these guys. So the Swiss would take all this stuff, and they would put it on trains, and they would take it around, or trucks or whatever, and they were all with Red Crosses on them, and they would deliver this stuff to all these Stalags. And you ought to see what was in a World War I Red Cross parcel. I mean, canned salmon, and unbelievable.
Despite the assistance from the Red Cross, Allied prisoners led a precarious existence. The German General Staff was not the first to realize that POWs were worth more alive than dead.
It has always been recognized that once you've got a prisoner of war, that prisoner of war will hold a lot of information in their head, both about their individual unit, but also details of commanders, types of equipment, and even intentions. It can be fair to say that the more senior the officer that you capture, the more likelihood there is going to be something in their head.
German officers were well aware that prisoners could be valuable assets in providing military intelligence, and unlike their French and British counterparts, they were willing to go to great lengths to extract such information. Between captor and captive, a deadly game of cat and mouse was set in motion. Unbeknownst to the British and the French, the Germans had established a spy network to maximize their chances of acquiring classified information. At first, their unsuspecting prisoners played right into their hands. With advances in aviation technology, World War I became the first conflict in which airplanes and pilots played a significant role. Advances in air defense, however, assured there would be many shootdowns. Both sides displayed an attitude of reverence toward captured pilots that afforded these POWs special privileges. It didn't take the German General Staff long to realize that recently downed pilots might be privy to valuable tactical information.
The Germans were very clever in World War I, trying to get both tactical and strategic information. They were interested in finding out just about everything they could.
They wanted to know technical information about weapons and weapons systems, no question about that. They also wanted to know about unit organization. Are we facing first-line troops? Are we facing second-rate troops or third-rate troops? Are they highly motivated? Are they likely to desert? Will they stand and fight or will they run?
Although German intelligence officers had little experience in spycraft, they proved to be quick studies in the art of interrogation.
How do you interrogate somebody? You gain their trust. You solicit their support by expressing sympathy for their situation. Make them believe that talking to you will help them somehow.
To create an atmosphere in which the illusion of trust can flourish, German agents lodged their captives in castles along the Rhine River Valley. Ensconced in the relative comfort of these home-like settings, Allied pilots felt more like honored guests than prisoners of war.
You were invited for lunch by the guy who shot you down. Lunch. And you went to the squadron mess, and you were treated to the best meal you've ever had. I mean, they ate well. Yeah. And they would say, we wanted to honor you because, you know, you are an enemy pilot, but yet you are one of us.
But the Germans quickly realized that their prisoners didn't usually talk about military issues. They tended to talk about their personal lives. In the spy community, this type of information is commonly referred to as passive intelligence.
Passive intelligence is the kind of information that relates to the person himself and his organization. It's the idea of who he is, where does he come from, his family information is important to them, his ethnic background would be important to them in some cases, where was he trained, what unit was he with, how does he feel about the war, how does he feel about his superiors.
Passive intelligence proved valuable when it indicated that there was an officer or a standing order that was causing dissent among the enlisted men. The German captors rarely missed an opportunity to capitalize on details that could gain them a tactical advantage on the battlefield. To maximize their chances of acquiring intelligence, the Germans put POWs in rooms with others who had similar ranks and backgrounds. There, the captives felt a sense of camaraderie and privacy.
They would put these people together hoping they would talk. And they did talk. And the Germans would listen in. And they would talk about all kinds of things.
So cunning was this technique that many of the men never realized they were divulging valuable information while the enemy was eavesdropping.
Now, interestingly, in their memoirs after the war, all of these guys who went through this, I didn't give them the time of day. Fact is, they did give them the time of day. These men were trained to elicit that kind of information. They got it.
The spy network turned out to be so effective that German agents eventually commandeered a small hotel in Karlsruhe near the Black Forest. Realizing that it was more efficient to eavesdrop using the new technology of voice recorders, they rigged the hotel with hidden microphones. While the rooms still resembled those of a hotel, prisoners could be put under close surveillance, then actually recorded. Some called it Camp Karlsruhe, others called it the Listening Hotel.
Those rooms were all bugged. They had microphones in the walls, they had microphones in the chandelier, they had microphones hidden all over the place. And in the lower floor, they had the recording stations, and they had 5 or 6 of these guys set up down there. And they would record this information, and they would listen to it and make notes at the same time.
Allied prisoners of war were initially housed in tents behind this building and then taken across the street where the Hotel Karlsruhe stood. Years later, the hotel was torn down. Few people in Karlsruhe had any idea what had gone on inside. The agents who secretly recorded the conversations of their POWs were pioneers in the development of listening devices.
It was the first use of what we would call modern technology to gather intelligence, and it was a well-kept secret. So the last thing the Germans wanted was for someone to find out that this hotel was actually a listening booth, so to speak.
For over 2 years, the spy operation went undetected. The POWs had no idea the Germans were spying on them, let alone recording their conversations. Part of their naivete may have stemmed from an upper-class mindset that was particularly pronounced among British officers.
And it was considered ungentlemanly to eavesdrop on an officer. Gentlemen didn't listen to other gentlemen's conversations. Now the Allies, particularly the British, believed that, and I guess we did too. But the Germans didn't buy it. You know, as far as they were concerned, you could listen to anybody's conversation. So it made them unique. Then, in a way, they had pushed that frontier that a little bit forward, and it paid tremendous dividends for them.
German intelligence officers archived all the information their agents had gathered. At this central headquarters, they built dossiers on thousands of captured officers. Their spy network worked without a hitch until a few prisoners discovered the microphones. As soon as a POW realized he was being bugged, the Germans transferred him out of the hotel. However, some prisoners managed to tape notes onto the furniture as a warning for those who followed. Soon, POWs were checking to see if bugging equipment was hidden in the rooms. As the war progressed, the subterfuge intensified. In 1917, an American naval officer was taken prisoner. During his captivity, he discovered information so vital that he would risk his life to get this intelligence back to the Allies. By 1917, after 3 years of fighting, the combatants of the First World War found themselves mired in a hopeless stalemate. Only the entry of the United States into the war in April of that year offered a chance to tip the balance. Within 6 months, Germany faced a national crisis. Its civilians were going hungry, and its army was running out of men to fill the ranks. But in May, Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg launched a last-gasp offensive into France. Its initial success exceeded their most optimistic expectations. During this time, 28-year-old Edward Isaacs was a junior gunnery officer aboard the transport ship USS President Lincoln. After helping to deliver nearly 5,000 American troops to France, the President Lincoln was returning to the United States when a German U-boat, the U-90, spotted it. For nearly 7 hours, Lieutenant Isaacs and his fellow crew members were unaware that a submarine trailed them, sometimes barely below the surface. Finally, the sub's captain, Walter Ramey, moved within 700 meters of his target and gave the order to fire 3 torpedoes. He scored a direct hit. The Lincoln sank rapidly. In accordance with standard operating procedure in the German Navy, Ramey gave the order for his submarine to surface among the ship's wreckage and survivors in an attempt to capture the captain. If Ramey couldn't find the captain, he was instructed to take the senior surviving officer. As the submarine moved toward them, the Lincoln's officers shed their hats and jackets. The captain took the tiller of his lifeboat to appear as a common sailor. The only officer left in uniform was Edward Isaacs.
So when Captain Lieutenant Ramey comes steaming through the wreckage and looking for, bingo, what does he spot? There's this guy in his uniform. So he brought Isaacs aboard, and he asked Isaacs what had happened to the captain. He said, if the captain's out here, you tell me, because if I don't get him, I'm taking you back to Germany.
At first, Isaacs was surprised by the courtesy showed him by Captain Ramey and his crew. He gratefully accepted Ramey's invitation to dine with him in the officers' wardroom. During his dinner, Isaacs did his best to answer such questions as how many American troops were in Europe and how quickly were they being brought across from the United States. What Captain Ramey didn't know is that the earnest young Edward Isaacs was a master at disguising his emotions. Isaacs made sure to give his captors grossly inflated figures. He told Ramey that the United States had already delivered 2 million men to France, and that the Navy had 75 large transports in service. According to Isaacs, the infusion of American troops had given the Allies renewed strength. This was not what Captain Ramey wanted to hear.
What they wanted to hear was like talk of mutiny, and are they having problems? Is there some indication that the solid front is about to crack? What's the weight of the Americans? How highly motivated are they? What are we up against?
In fact, Isaacs had heard that the French army was already in a state of mutiny and that the British could not survive through the winter of 1918-1919. But he passed off false information. Knowing his story was still believable, he told Ramey the Allies were well prepared to carry on the fight into 1919.
If the Allies are talking about fighting into 1919, that's a pretty good indication to the Germans that these guys plan to stay a lot longer than the Germans think they can stay. See, so this is not good news.
Over the next 5 days, Edward Isaacs mingled with the submarine's officers, gathering enough details to confirm his suspicion that there were ways to detect the presence of a submerged enemy submarine.
The submarine that he was on leaked oil all the time, and the oil tanks on that particular type of U-boat would never seal entirely, and so that whenever the U-boat traveled at close to the surface at periscope depth, she left a trail of oil in the water. It wasn't too bad for the U-boat in rough water because it would break up the oil, but in calm water, it left an indelible trail where she could be tracked down.
Difficult as it is to imagine, Captain Ramey allowed Isaacs to keep his automatic pistol and gave him free run of the boat. Isaacs made good use of his time.
Several times a day, he would go into the navigation room and look at Ramey's chart. He studied it carefully. He thought that he had discovered the secret of the route the German U-boats were using to come out of Germany and out into the North Sea and around Scotland into the Atlantic.
Even before the submarine docked, Lieutenant Isaacs made up his mind that he was going to escape and take his intelligence back to Allied headquarters in London.
His unmitigated motive was to get this information that he had, or thought he had, back to the Allies. He genuinely believed that he had critically important secret information. He knew something about the Germans and their U-boat operations that nobody else knew.
Like all military intelligence, Isaacs' information would only remain relevant for a limited period of time. He had to act quickly. On June 11, 1918, the U-90 berthed in the German harbor of Wilhelmshaven. By that time, the United States had been at war with Germany for over a year. And as far as Isaacs knew, America's involvement had had little impact on the war. He was unaware that the Americans had recently scored battlefield victories at Belleau Wood and Château Thierry, just 40 miles north of Paris. Edward Isaacs was taken by train to the prison camp at Villingen, close to the Swiss border. Once at Villingen, he focused all his energy on escape. He soon began to hatch a plan with an American combat pilot named Harold Willis. While Willis secretly copied a map of Switzerland that a fellow POW had smuggled into camp, Isaacs drafted these escape plans. They detailed the distance from the window of his barracks to the camp fence. On the afternoon of October 6, 1918, Isaacs recruited 13 other inmates who were also planning to escape. He gave assignments to everybody and told them to be ready to go that night.
He was doing what they call a blitz. It was just slam down the windows, run out the runways, and go over the wire.
Once he was beyond the prison walls, Isaacs and Willis knew that civilians, not prison security, posed their greatest threat. As the war had progressed, civilian hatred for enemy soldiers had become so intense that ordinary citizens sometimes formed posses to track down escapees. Managing to elude civilians and police alike, Isaacs and Willis walked 40 miles through rugged terrain and swam the Rhine River during flood season. 1 week later, Isaacs and Willis reached Switzerland and safety. By the end of October, Isaacs was back in London. In an ironic twist of fate, as he walked through the door of the Allied Command Headquarters, he learned that the German Admiralty had just recalled all their U-boats. The war was winding to a close, and Isaac's information was no longer relevant. 2 weeks later, the armistice was signed. Even though the intelligence he carried no longer mattered, Lieutenant Edward Isaacs was celebrated as a hero. And in 1919, President Wilson presented him with the Congressional Medal of Honor. Isaac's experience proved that POWs could discover vital intelligence during captivity. The Second World War would provide even more opportunities for prisoners to gather and exchange top-secret information. "11 years after the end of the First World War, diplomats from around the world gathered in Geneva to discuss rules of war. Their concern was that in spite of the existing Hague Convention and the activities of the Red Cross, abuse of POWs had continued throughout World War I. The agreement known as the Geneva Convention established that prisoners must receive adequate food and medical care and be given the opportunity to correspond with their families. No constraint was to be applied to a prisoner who refused to give any information beyond name, rank, and serial number. What's more, the maximum disciplinary penalty a prisoner could ever receive, even for escaping, was 30 days in solitary confinement. However, some nations did not become signatories of the Geneva Convention of 1929. Japan refused to ratify the agreement. Most in the military there believed it undermined the Bushido concept of unlimited discipline, the very foundation of Japan's military structure. Russia didn't sign because Joseph Stalin mistrusted the Swiss.
Stalin saw the Swiss as, capitalist dogs, and didn't want these capitalists to be nosing around his country.
Stalin refused to allow the Red Cross to enter the Soviet Union. As a result, Russian soldiers were prevented from receiving Russian parcels from the Red Cross while on enemy soil. The experience of World War I taught British intelligence chiefs that prisoners of war could be a valuable resource if they could tap into it. By 1939, as German tanks rolled across Poland, staff officers at the British War Office took it upon themselves to establish an agency that would facilitate POW escape plans. Norman Crockett, a frontline combatant during World War I and by then a London stockbroker, was put in charge of the organization. Known as MI9, this ultra-secret POW communication, support, and supply agency was headquartered in a room of the Metropole Hotel in London, just a few blocks from the War Office. Under MI9, intelligence agents were sent to special interrogation training centers where they learned how to finesse information out of captured enemy soldiers. When the Blitzkrieg swept over the Low Countries in the spring of 1940, nearly 2 million French and Belgian soldiers and airmen became prisoners of war. Norman Crockett responded quickly. He believed that MI9's principal aim in the early stages of the war was to instill in the armed services a quality of escape-mindedness. British soldiers were trained to be in a state of constant readiness. If caught in enemy hands, they were to seize the first opportunity to escape. 2 months later, 200,000 British servicemen were evacuated at Dunkirk. But another 50,000 British soldiers were captured. The sheer power of rapid air and armored warfare had changed the notion of being captured from a personal disgrace into something more common, like an accident. The British and French were staggered by the extent of their defeat. Captives taken back to Germany became known as Krieges, from the German word for prisoner of war. A World War I aviator himself, Rex Marshal Hermann Göring, ordered that Allied pilots be given somewhat better treatment than others while in captivity. They were passed through holding camps called gulags for questioning. In the beginning, interrogators pressured them for information, but after only 4 months of war, German intelligence agents suggested a change in tactics.
By 1940, they were easing up on their interrogation techniques because other Germans were coming back and saying, look, you can get a lot more with honey than you can with vinegar. And so the Durchgangslager, or the Dulag Luft, became more of a battle of wits than a battle of wills.
MI9 quickly established a network with agents in each of the 90 permanent compounds. The Allied POWs, known as the Barbed Wire Front, waged war on their captors from within. Norman Crockett knew that training for escapes was essential, but he believed the role of intelligence gathering was even more important. He hand-picked airmen and soldiers and taught them how to surreptitiously communicate with special codes should they become POWs. Some escapes were even planned so that escapees could simply gather intelligence behind enemy lines, allow themselves to be recaptured, and then transmit the information through coded letters back home to London.
The British treated escape as a game. This was a school prank. A dangerous one, but still a determined game.
Some POWs were inveterate escapers. For this type of individual, life in the camp was bearable simply because he was mentally and physically preparing to break out.
First thing he does, he just looks around and says, how do I get out? And there were guys like that. And they would escape at all costs from anywhere. They might be recaptured, but that didn't matter. They might have to do solitary confinement. That didn't matter, but they're out of there at the earliest possible time.
The intelligence organizations that sprung up within the camps were known as X. Within these complex units, everybody had a well-defined role.
people forging documents, people bribing guards to get hold of cameras, to take photographs to go on the forged identities, acquisition of maps. People with special engineering capabilities would therefore be the primary movers in developing tunnels.
As the war progressed, MI9 devised devious methods to promote escape. Aid organizations were created to cover the shipment of parcels. Some were purely humanitarian packages. Others were loaded with equipment meant to facilitate escape.
Charitable organizations that were sending games and toys and various things into the prisoner of war camps. Now, within these toys and games were hidden maps, money, even wireless sets.
Wireless sets were smuggled into prisoner of war camps, mainly so POWs could receive messages from the BBC's radio transmissions. MI9 mapped out the best escape routes. Those who managed to break out tried to make contact with one of the many escape lines that stretched across Europe.
Spain was officially neutral in World War II. Spain was a fascist country. I mean, we look at Franco. Franco was a fascist. But a lot of things were done in Spain under Franco's rule and under the Nazis' nose that the Nazis didn't like a bit. Spain became the promised land for people who were escaping through France and went to southern France.
In Spain and the occupied countries, escapers were often helped by locals who refused to accept the fact that they had been conquered. Many of these resistance fighters were women. As the war continued and more resources were tied up chasing escaped POWs, the Germans' attitude toughened.
And the Germans say, publish this document. It says, escape is no longer a sport or a game, that there are now what they call death zones. Anybody caught without their papers in so-and-so place, escaped prisoners of war, anybody would be executed.
Not only did life become more treacherous for the escaping POW, but also for the civilian who aided in his escape. Resistance organizations proved to be easily penetrated by the Nazis or their collaborators.
They knew. And if you helped an Allied airman, these people, especially the Gestapo types, they'd haul this family out and just execute them straight as a warning to everybody else not to do that.
No matter how harsh the conditions in the German stalags, nothing could compare to the Allied POW experience on the Pacific Front. It was a horror that would be hidden from the rest of the world for years. In 1942, the Japanese army transported more than 60,000 captured Allied soldiers to Burma and Thailand to work in the infamous Railway of Death. Nearly half were British, the rest Australian, Dutch, and a small number of Americans. These POWs quickly discovered that the Japanese did not follow the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention.
They wouldn't ratify it because, according to the militarists who ran the place at the time, said that this convention requires us to treat prisoners better than we treat our own soldiers. This convention flies in the face of those values which we hold dear in Japanese, if you will, militant Bushido culture.
Bushido was an ancient samurai code that had been resurrected during the 1920s and 30s, when military extremists seized control of the government. Bushido required total obedience to the emperor, all the way down through each level of the imperial army. Authority was unquestioned. An order from an officer was equivalent to an order from the emperor himself. According to the code of Bushido, surrender was a disgrace. Any soldier who lay down his arms was perceived as having dishonored himself and his nation.
They just told their soldiers, you will not surrender. You will die before you surrender. Period. End of it. And if you become a prisoner, you have lost your Japanese identity.
Japanese soldiers viewed Allied prisoners as cowardly, soft, and materialistic. This conflict of cultures was to result in one of the most infamous secrets of the entire war, which would become known as the Bataan Death March. One of the first glimpses that U.S. soldiers got of Bushido came in the spring of 1942. When American military units on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines ran out of ammunition, fuel, food, and medicine. As an organized fighting force, they were finished. Rarely had an enemy caught an American military force so unprepared. After they surrendered, American and Filipino prisoners were made to walk under a sizzling tropical sun without food or water from Mariveles to Camp O'Donnell on the island of Luzon, 75 miles away.
Well, one of the things you lose as a prisoner is your individuality. You know, you've lost your identity. It's one of the most devastating things to happen to you because they're not going to worry about your name. You see, you lose that kind of thing, and then you lose your sense of what's past and present and future. You're living in the now. And when conditions are really very bad, you're reduced to an animal state where you do things that you would never do under normal circumstances.
Those men who broke ranks and ran to the side of the road to scoop up a drink of water were immediately shot. Their fellow POWs were horrified.
All of a sudden they're seeing their buddies who can't walk anymore, they fall down. And a Japanese soldier walks up and they either bayonet them or shoot them right there in front of them.
Of the 75,000 Americans and Filipinos who surrendered to the Japanese army in the Philippines in 1942, between 7,000 to 10,000 died or were killed on the march. The atrocities that occurred during that journey through the jungle were not publicly known for another 2 years. Not until the first prisoners returned home was their story told. Government officials were stunned. Afraid of the reaction from their own citizens, they did their best to cover up the incident.
The government exercised a great deal more control then than they do now over what can and cannot be said. But soldiers have a different obligation. You give up a certain individual freedom when you're armed. So these guys had no permission to talk about their captivity. But when they got home, eventually a radio show was made about the Bataan March. People were aghast, absolutely shocked at this. Couldn't believe it.
Beginning in 1942, Japanese officials used captured Allied soldiers to make propaganda films and radio broadcasts to further their cause. No one was more valuable for these broadcasts than a prisoner with celebrity status. Louis Zamperini, a runner who at age 17 competed in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin and had shaken hands with the Führer himself, was one such celebrity. After spending 3 years running track at the University of Southern California, Zamperini joined the Army Air Corps and in 1942 became a bombardier on a B-24. While on a rescue mission to search for a downed B-25 off the island of Palmyra, his plane crashed. and he and 3 other members of the crew were set adrift in a rubber dinghy for weeks. Not all survived the ordeal. The tail gunner died and was buried at sea. Louis Zamperini and the others drifted for 47 days, only to be captured by a Japanese patrol boat. Zamperini then endured months of torture at the hands of his captors. At one point, a date for his execution was set.
They were allowed to use the bayonet anytime they wanted to, or shoot you. Anything you did wrong that displeased them, you could be killed on the spot. So what you thought was one thing, what you did was another.
Then Zamperini's captors discovered that he had been an Olympic running star. Suddenly, the POW Zamperini was more valuable alive than dead. Unknown to Zamperini, his Japanese captors were grooming him to be a pawn in their propaganda campaign. They hid him in a secret prison camp and waited. Once he was declared dead, the Japanese plan was to shock the Americans by having Zamperini broadcast that he was not only alive but flourishing in a Japanese prison camp. Zamperini agreed to make one broadcast if he could write and deliver it in his own words, not the ones scripted for him by the Japanese.
So what I did, I wrote things that only my parents would know about. My hunting rifle and my buddy that I hunted with in high school. And if they could pick up 1 or 2 words that they knew is in association with me, then they know it positively was me.
There was such heavy static during the radio broadcast that Lou Zamperini's voice was nearly obliterated.
This will be the first time in 2.5 years that you will have heard my voice.
U.S. government officials doubted whether the recording had really been made by Zamperini, but his mother was sure that she'd been listening to the voice of her son.
Even so, the government called my mother and said, let's face it, your son is dead, give him up as we have.
The Japanese wanted Zamperini to continue making broadcasts, following the scripts they had prepared. Japanese officials introduced him to other servicemen who routinely performed on Radio Tokyo.
So I met 3 guys, an American and 2 Australians, who were doing the same thing, living in a hotel room, eating in the cafeteria like an American-style food. And when I shook their hands, they couldn't look me in the eye. They looked down, and when they did that, they were sending me a message, you know, don't do it.
In exchange for his cooperation, the Japanese offered Louis Zamperini better living conditions. He turned them down. Until his release at the time of Japan's surrender, he was forced to endure multiple beatings.
How do you endure it? Well, you want to live. And I think my training as an athlete, as an Olympic runner, every athlete wants to win. They always taught us as an athlete, never quit. You fight right to the finish.
The first half of the century witnessed the beginning of modern warfare, and with it, the end of chivalrous behavior. Captors realized they could extract from their prisoners military secrets that might influence the outcome in the battlefield, and they even developed spy technology to capitalize on this. At the same time, POWs rose to the challenge. Some men were willing to go to any lengths to escape and carry vital intelligence back to their own leaders. During World War II, Allied prisoners in Germany carried on the fight behind barbed wire. On the Pacific Front, POWs were subjected to appalling atrocities during captivity. In spite of the brutality, prisoners learned to sharpen their wits and harden their wills in order to survive. Freedom was an ever-present dream of home and family. Since World War II, warring nations have continued to exploit prisoners of war as bargaining chips and propaganda pawns. It is a sad legacy of modern warfare that captors have continued to subject POWs to inhumane treatment, sometimes as punishment and sometimes in the continual quest to learn their secrets.